Progressives today lack a project. Their project tends to be the program of their conservative adversaries, with a humanizing discount. They appear on the stage of contemporary history as the humanizers of the inevitable. In the United States, the Democratic Party, ever the party of the progressives, has failed to develop a sequel to Roosevelt's New Deal, a program responsive to the needs, interests, and aspirations of the broad working class majority of the country. In Europe, institutionally conservative social democracy has long retreated from any attempt to reinvent the economy and the state. Progressives habitually mask their lack of a project by genuflecting to progressive taxation. They put political piety in the place of transformative effect. Here I speak to how progressives should address the relation between taxation and inequality. I suggest 3 lessons supported by historical experience around the world. The first lesson concerns what ultimately matters to the attenuation of inequality in contemporary societies. The answer is the organization of access to economic and educational opportunity, and therefore the reshaping of the institutions of the market and of democracy that would secure such an enlargement of opportunity for the ordinary man and woman. Consider an example that illustrates what is at stake in the understanding of this lesson. The most admired social and economic regime in the world today is Scandinavian social democracy. If the world could vote, it would vote to become Sweden. Not the real Sweden, but a Sweden of fantasy, supposedly shaped only by entitlement programs and progressive taxation. The real Sweden was built by decades of conflict over political power and economic and educational advantage. Taxation and social spending finished the job that had begun long before. We cannot have this Scandinavian epilogue unless we are willing to undergo the preceding narrative, the narrative of contest over the structure. This lesson has a large significance for our political and economic ideas. For over 200 years, the basic model of ideological controversy has been a kind of hydraulic model. More government, less market, more market, less government, or some compromise between the market and the state. The truth is that the most important innovations that would result in a sustained broadening of economic and educational opportunity require innovation in the arrangements that define the market economy and that shape representative democracy. In our economic debates, what we find in the world today is that the progressives tend to focus only on the demand side, having lost faith in the governmental conduct of the economy, they have found refuge in a vulgar Keynesianism. And they have abandoned the supply side to conservatives who take for granted the present form of the market economy. What we would require in the light of this lesson is a progressive approach to the supply side, an approach that focused on the innovations needed to produce the broadening of opportunity, and above all, to allow larger numbers of people to gain access to the advanced knowledge-based sectors of production. The second lesson has to do with the effect of taxation and social spending, taken as a whole, on inequality and its diminishment. The lesson is that what really matters is the aggregate level of the tax take and how it is spent. Even if a high tax take is financed by regressive taxation, the progressive profile of taxation is much less important than how much the government takes in taxes and how it spends that revenue. To understand this lesson, consider a contemporary riddle. On paper, the most progressive tax system among the rich North Atlantic democracies is the tax system of the United States, which relies heavily on the personal income tax and on other forms of taxation of labor through the payroll. But the United States is by far the most unequal of these countries. By contrast, the much more equal European social democracies rely chiefly on the regressive and indirect taxation of consumption. The solution to this riddle is that by relying on the indirect and regressive taxation of consumption, on a form of taxation that minimizes economic disturbance, those European countries are able to raise more revenue and then to spend the revenue redistributively. Everything that is lost by way of progressivity on the revenue-raising side of the budget is gained in double on the spending side. The United States has a tax take of less than 30% of GDP. A European social democracy like Sweden or France has a tax take of around 45% of GDP, a huge difference. And how can we raise a large tax take without creating huge economic trouble? By relying on the most neutral tax, the tax that least affects relative prices. It is the so-called comprehensive flat rate value-added tax. It takes a constant amount of every transformation of an input into an output, of every accretion of value in the whole process of production and circulation of goods and services. And because it is neutral, it minimizes disturbance to the economic incentives to save, to invest, and to employ. A great deal of money in the hands of the state, for the state to invest in people and in their capabilities. That's the explanation of the riddle. Although the profile of taxation matters less to the redress of inequality, than the aggregate level of the tax take and the way in which it is spent, taxation can nevertheless be used as a subsidiary device in the struggle against extreme inequality. And thus we come to the third lesson. The third lesson has to do with what we can expect of a tax system if we are indeed committed to progressive redistribution. The two most important targets of progressive taxation are the hierarchy of standards of living and the accumulation of economic power, the use of wealth to control other people, either directly or through influence on government. The first target, the hierarchy of standards of living, can best be hit by a steeply progressive tax on individual expenditure and consumption. This tax taxes the difference between the total income of each taxpayer, including his income from capital, dividends, for example, and his invested saving. That difference is what the individual spends on himself and takes out of the pool of investment available to society to create its future. Think of it as a personal income tax with an exemption for invested savings. That's the direct way to hit the hierarchy of standards of living. The personal income tax, by comparison, is a blunt instrument, which on the whole operates as a tax on middle-class salaries, because rich people have many ways to shield themselves against this tax. There are real and false objections to the tax on personal expenditure. A false objection has to do with the idea that it would promote hoarding rather than investment, but we would design it so that saving would need to be invested. Moreover, in these very unequal societies, the rich must save, and the moneyless are unable to save. A more significant concern has to do with the definition of invested saving. We would have to have a restricted definition to exclude, for example, housing and define it as a form of consumption. The tax could operate in the following way. People with a very low standard of living would not only pay nothing, but receive something from the state, a minimum guaranteed income. In the broad middle range, people would begin to pay as their standard of living and their level of personal expenditure rose. And at the highest level, they would pay a great deal. A practical advantage of this tax, by contrast to the personal income tax, is that the top marginal rate has no ceiling. In principle, beyond a certain level of luxury living, an individual might have to pay to the government $3 or $4 for every dollar that he spends on himself. The sole limit is the limit imposed by political power and political will. Such a tax has almost never been implemented in the world. And maybe the reason is that it's too effective. It calls the bluff on the redistributive pretensions of the pietistic progressives. A second target of progressive taxation is the accumulation of economic power. One way to hit it is to tax capital outright. But a tax on capital is disruptive when not connected to a transfer of property from one generation to the next. And whether disruptive or not, it would be fiercely resisted. The better way to hit the target is to focus on the taxation of inheritance and its anticipation through gifts within the family. Such a tax would appeal to all those who take seriously a principle of equal opportunity. And it would have a cumulative effect across time, diminishing the extent to which the life chances of the individual are shaped by the accidents of birth. So there you have the three lessons. What ultimately matters to diminishing inequality is the organization of access to economic and educational opportunity, achieved through innovation in the arrangements that define the market economy and political democracy. With respect to the system of taxation and social spending, what counts most is not the progressive profile of taxation, but rather the aggregate level of the tax take and how it is spent, even if the higher tax take is financed by regressive taxation. And to the extent that taxation can nevertheless have a redistributive use, we should focus on its two chief targets: the hierarchy of standards of living and the accumulation of economic power. The hierarchy of standards of living to be hit through a tax on personal expenditure on a steeply progressive rate, and the accumulation of economic power to be hit through a tax on inheritance and intra-family gifts. How should such an ambitious program be implemented? Someone who thinks technocratically or managerially might suppose that we should begin by tinkering with the tax system and only then go back to attempt to achieve a sustained heightening of the tax take and ensure that the higher tax take is spent redistributively, and only much later turn to the aim of innovating in the institutions to accomplish a sustained broadening of economic and educational opportunity. But that's not how societies change. If we think realistically and politically, we should rather conclude that only in the climate of a contest over the structure are we likely to make any real progress in changing the role of taxation in social spending. Transformative ambition to be advanced by gradualist, fragmentary, and cumulative means. So politics first, but politics informed by structural vision. Politics first, but politics needs an ally. Its ally is the imagination.